Seemingly oblivious to the malice hidden in plain sight, Jeremy McDonald works on the 7-Eleven ranch as a close friend to the Jackson family and Deborah Rudibar. Months later, police and teams of investigators search the premises of the 7-Eleven ranch. The family is brought in for questioning, unveiling a mysterious occurrence between farmhand Jeremy McDonald along with Stephanie and Dave Jackson.
During the interrogation, Stephanie reveals that a few months ago, Jeremy and Dave had found animal remains while shoveling manure in the horse corral.
Nothing could have prepared Jeremy for this situation.
I can imagine that the stress of trying to cover this up was probably miserable for them, unless they're just not wired like normal humans, which is possible.
Was this a cruel test of Jeremy's loyalty to the family, with the intent of finding a replacement for Jake, or a ploy to frame him? In just 1 hour, the truth will become plain to see. Families are interesting microcosms of society. There are people who you love and those you detest in the world. Outside of the home, one can simply avoid those who cause them angst. But inside the home, this isn't possible. It's no secret that 90% of murders are committed by those closest to the victim. Sometimes family struggles start small, then fester, especially when the members take each other for granted. When individuals assume that all family members have the same goals and heap judgment on those they see aren't pulling their weight, the situation can boil over into monstrous results. In most cases, this simple resentment gets hashed out in an argument or someone leaving. But in the most extreme examples, it can lead to murder. After all, familiarity breeds contempt. In the early days of spring 2017, Dave Jackson struggles to maintain the 7-Eleven ranch on his own. Without the aid of his brother-in-law, Jake Millison, who has been missing for roughly 2 years, the family decides to hire Jeremy McDonald, who is a friend of the family, as a farmhand.
Jake's absence obviously leaves a considerable void in the operation of the family farm. It puts more pressure on Dave, and over time, it becomes unbearable for them to exist working together on the farm.
Southwest of the southern Sasquatch mountain range, in Quartz Creek Valley, Pitkin, Colorado, a well-known ranch is surrounded with the mysterious disappearance of Jake Millison, son of the owner, Deborah Rudibar, and brother to Stephanie Jackson. 29-year-old Jake Millison is known as a hard worker, spending the majority of his time working on his family's farm, the 7-Eleven ranch. Most, if not all, his effort go unnoticed by his family. In fact, his mother, Deborah, is convinced that Jake is inadequate and that his personal time away from the ranch has taken away too much from his responsibilities to the ranch.
It isn't enough that Jake sacrifices everything for the ranch. Deborah demands extra help, bringing her daughter Stephanie and Stephanie's husband Dave back to the ranch, even though Jake doesn't get along with his sister.
As animosity grows over the question of inheritance, Jake shows more irritability and discontent with his situation back at the ranch. Even his friends and coach can tell things are falling apart.
He didn't like him. He didn't respect him. He didn't want him around.
It's evident that Jake hates his brother-in-law. He's worried that after all his hard work and dedication, the ranch might actually go to Stephanie and by association Dave, someone who just married into the family and who has not earned his place.
I understood that his family dynamic was strained. I knew for sure that he didn't get along with his brother-in-law and sister.
Jake's interest in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu causes rifts in the relationship with his mother. Deborah's perception of the practice is that of ill intent, with an aura of crime and illegal activity.
Deborah has high expectations of her son and doesn't approve of the choices he's making in life. She was obviously not happy with his commitments outside of the ranch. To make ends meet, Jake grows and sells psychedelic mushrooms and marijuana to college students, much to Deborah's disapproval.
Jake spends much of his free time away from the ranch, training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with his friends. However, Deborah's perspective is that Jake isn't attributing enough time or showing enough commitment to the ranch.
It was well known in the family that Jake was contributing finances to the farm operation. They didn't really care where he got the money, but obviously he was doing something on the side to make a lucrative income. And it was determined that he was obviously in town selling drugs.
Oddly, Deborah believes that Jake getting into the wrong crowd and dealing drugs has something to do with his involvement with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Many of the people involved in the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu club are police officers, as well as civilians from the community. So in their communication, they are there to work out, get physically fit, as everyone is, but they're also, as police officers, you listen in the conversation and you pick things up, what's going on in the community.
Jake's life outside of the ranch is well-rounded.
That was Jake. He wasn't overly vocal about things. He definitely didn't talk unless he kind of knew what he was talking about. The amount that he told me, I understood that his family dynamic was strained. I knew for sure that he didn't get along with his brother-in-law and sister. We did have conversations about that. I think he pretty well considered his brother-in-law pretty much a mortal enemy is how I would describe it. I mean, he didn't use those words, but he didn't like him. And I always kind of suspected maybe that some of the conflict they had may have been a portion of his interest in jiu-jitsu.
Jake's relationship with his sister was never as close as his relationship with his mother, Deborah.
I got the impression that he was both contentious with his mom and also maybe still loyal to her in a way, or maybe he was just loyal to the idea of the ranch.
As Jake struggles to keep the ranch going, Deborah entices her daughter Stephanie to move back to the ranch with her family. Jake's relationship with Stephanie is jaded, and upon her arrival from Denver, Jake makes it clear that he loathes her presence on the ranch. Trouble ensues when Stephanie's husband Dave incites aggression in an attempt to dominate Jake's space on the ranch.
The relationship between the two siblings is fraught with peril. With this amount of favoritism, it's impossible to avoid resentment on either side.
Both Deborah and Stephanie had inherited something from the original owner, Rudy. After Deborah marries Rudy, upon his death, Deborah inherits the ranch. Stephanie, in turn, is given $80,000 immediately after Rudy and Deborah marry, later inheriting $30,000 upon Rudy's death, which she used towards a down payment for a house in Denver. Jake never received a single penny.
Stephanie receives $100,000 from Rudy, while Jake is still trying to earn money for himself until his disappearance.
With Jake missing, Dave learns about Jake's dedication and sacrifice the hard way. Thankfully, Jeremy was more than willing to help him, but that's a huge task to undertake when the family's caretaker brother and son is nowhere to be found.
Jake's presence on the ranch is substantial enough to need an extra hire. Jeremy is just that, but he's also an outsider. He isn't a Jackson. nor is he one of Deborah's kids.
In most cases, the loss or disappearance of a family member has a long-term effect. They don't really know what that's going to be till they start living the life that they're going through. There's a hole now, a gap. There's not the work on the farm being done by Jake. They start to miss it and feel the pressure.
While Jake's family struggles with his absence, his friends continue to search for him, asking local authorities, asking people around town, and checking in with his mother, Deborah.
When Jake's friends ask where he may have gone, she tells them that Jake is competing in a mixed martial arts tournament out of town. Out of concern, Jake's friends call the coordinator in Denver and are shocked to hear that Jake was not there. Early spring in Quartz Creek, Colorado. It's been over a year since Jake Millison is reported missing by friends and family. Due to his absence, the Jacksons and Deborah have decided to hire a friend to help them on the ranch.
Dave and Jeremy walk into the horse corral and begin to muck it out. They've worked with horses before, so they're familiar with the smell.
As Jeremy and Dave get to work, the women inside keep a close eye on the two, weary of their movements.
Stephanie and Deborah's concern over Jake's whereabouts diminish. It's due to the fact of Jeremy and Dave's increased workload on the farm.
It's been roughly 15 minutes since Jeremy arrived on the ranch, and the two are already working up a sweat, while Stephanie and Deborah keep a close eye on them from inside the house, leaving a bitter taste in Dave's mouth. This dichotomy between the men at work and the woman inside has caused Dave to complain a few times in the past.
While work is being done on the ranch, friends of Jake's are also working tirelessly, pushing officials to try and find him.
Jeremy and Dave dig deeper and work harder, but one question remains. Where is Jake Millison? Jake's absence shifts all responsibility and work into Dave's hands, tasks he was reluctant to undertake. One day, Dave discusses with Stephanie how overwhelming the work is. In response, Stephanie does the unthinkable, firing a gun into the floorboards to get him to stop.
After being threatened with a gun for complaining, it must have infuriated Dave to have to work against his will, but at least now he had some help.
It's quite obvious that the resentment this family has extends beyond Jake. They hate each other, and it goes into their everything that they do in their operation of the family and the farm has a resentment that goes beyond after Jake disappears. However, Dave is known to be erratic and displaying fits of anger. Dave and Jake are involved in an altercation where Dave opens up his jacket and exposes a gun in his waistband.
Shortly after being threatened, Jake files an order of protection from Dave, but retracts it days later. However, the animosity grows to the point where Deborah decides the two boys are no longer allowed on the ranch at the same time, forcing Stephanie, Dave, and their son to live in an apartment in town.
Stephanie is livid and claims that Jake is ruining her life. Moments like this breed resentment, especially when an inheritance of this magnitude is at stake.
Jake rants at the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu club or at the local bar with his friends. Those closest to Jake are privy to his family feuds and how much Jake resents Dave and fears him.
Jake's friends were persistent. They knew from everything Jake had told them that if anything were to happen to their friend, it would most likely be because of his family or Dave. Jake's reputation of telling people if he was ever going to miss a class made it seem really suspicious that he would just leave without saying anything.
A few days later, for sure within that first week, there was concern. Everybody thought that was odd. I can't really recall anymore, but I believe that his friends, we maybe also heard from one of his friends, and they were concerned, because they obviously even if he was injured, he wouldn't lose contact with them. And so that was odd.
Jake's sudden absence from the dojo and lack of communication causes considerable concern amongst his friends. A couple of his closest friends go to the ranch where Deborah tells him that Jake left for a martial arts event, but his friends know that Jake wouldn't have gone without saying anything to them. Deborah claims that Jake has gone to Reno, Nevada for an MMA tournament.
What I recall, and the first explanation that we were given, was he had gone off to Reno and he was going to go train at an MMA gym there. It just didn't sound like in the realm of reality that he would do that without talking to me or to one of the other coaches, and so we knew that that just wasn't true.
In spite of the concern from Jake's friends and their growing suspicion, there wasn't enough to incite a search at the ranch.
We got worried enough. Those guys were kind of the ones to make the calls and to use more official channels, hopefully to get a better result, which unfortunately I don't think really did much. I just don't think anybody took this thing serious initially, and that was very frustrating. I know that Jake's friend group was extremely frustrated because they knew something was wrong.
Jeremy and Dave come across an excessively profound stench pluming from the manure in the horse corral. Jeremy tries to shovel, but the putrid smell gets worse with each layer of excavated manure removed. Plumes of foulness intrude on the fresh air. Dave continuously leaves to empty the wheelbarrow, but Jeremy catches his shovel and something in the pile. He feels around, slowly realizing that whatever his shovel caught on does not belong in the pile of manure. When Dave returns from dumping the manure, he finds Jeremy at a standstill. Pulling away from the pile of manure, the two gag in utter shock and disgust.
The two men seem completely dazed and confused by what they found.
Stephanie sees Dave and immediately knows something has gone wrong. Her panic is noticed by the mother, Deborah. Stephanie wastes no time and rushes out of the house to the horse corral. She hopes it's nothing but an injury or issue with one of the horses. Early spring of 2017, Jake Millison is still nowhere to be found. Farmhand and friend of the family, Jeremy McDonald, and brother-in-law to Jake, Dave Jackson, do their best to maintain the ranch in Jake's absence. This is much to Dave's displeasure, but Dave continues to work, most likely out of fear of conflict with his wife, Stephanie.
There's already so much tension in this family due to Jake's disappearance. But farmhand and family friend Jeremy happily accepts his new role alongside Dave. Tension between the family members continues to build, and resentment is high, and now Stephanie and Deborah have another issue to resolve.
Jeremy and Dave come across an excessively profound stench pluming from the manure in the horse corral. When Dave leaves to empty the wheelbarrow, he returns to Jeremy, shocked by what he has uncovered and what seems to be the source of the putrefying smell.
At this point, Dave doesn't really know what to do. He seems surprised and shocked, but that could just be a way to hide his panic.
Deborah watches from afar while tension brews between Jeremy and Dave, keeping a close eye on her daughter as she enters the horse corral.
Unaware of the situation, Stephanie arrives at the manure pile and immediately yells, "Let's get my mom." She wants to make sure that she gets Deborah, who is going to be able to control the situation and help this process through.
Dave tries to collect himself and gain control of the situation as he waits for his wife to talk to Deborah.
For Stephanie to be this frantic and desperate for Deborah's guidance goes to show just how much control Deborah had over everyone in her family.
Deborah explains to Stephanie that what the rotting remains are must either be a bear or a mountain lion, illegal game in the state of Colorado, which Deborah explains is the result of Jake's hunting.
Whatever Dave and Jeremy caught a whiff of while digging in the manure pile would be toxic beyond belief. It's been frozen, thawed, and in manure, there's gases and cells that are created by manure rotting, combined with the decomposing remains of an animal or a body. It would smell horrible. The odor coming out of that when they exposed it would have been unimaginable.
When Stephanie returns to the horse corral, she explains to Jeremy and Dave that the remains they found are actually that of an animal. She tells them what Deborah told her, that the remains are of a mountain lion or bear that Jake had illegally hunted.
One thing is certain, during all the mayhem and confusion about finding this in this pile, is that Deborah is controlling the situation.
How much power did this woman have over everyone at the ranch?
A few years before Jake vanishes, he works on commercial fishing boats in Alaska, giving Deborah $15,000 a month for the ranch. Upon his return, Deborah blames Jake for his lack of presence and the decline of the ranch, guilting him into giving her more of his hard-earned money.
Jake is the only one putting anything into the ranch. Stephanie tries to start a horse riding business, but it's Jake who takes care of the horses and is putting tons of his own money into the ranch.
No one ever in the family took Jake's side. He was always wrong. Yet he was the one who was providing money to the farm, working hard.
The night of Jake Millison's disappearance begins with growing animosity between mother and son. When Jake injures his ankle during sparring, Deborah is furious, assuming Jake will no longer work on the ranch sufficiently.
Deborah works in a nursing home, and we all know what that's like. You have to move people from bed to chair to back and forth into showers, into baths or whatever. So she has got some strength in her body, and some of these people are obviously probably more heavy than Jake. And she's also worked on the ranch all her life with Stephanie and Jake.
With no comfort towards Jake's injury, Deborah expects his tasks to be complete before she comes home from her double shift at the nursing home.
This resentment between two strong-headed people disrupts the prosperity of the ranch. Finally, Deborah is fed up and decides to do something about it.
With all the resentment brewing in this family, any piece of anger or plot or something that's going on can cause the pot to boil over and cause a problem. Obviously, Jake is telling this to his friends in town, so they're aware of the problems that are in this family. So this is what they are dealing with. As Jake disappears, they are starting to think, I wonder what happened.
Jake's friends continue to push local law enforcement to question Jake's family, which leads to some inconsistencies in their stories.
Jake's friends are adamant that his entire family are pitted against him, pushing officials to investigate Deborah and Stephanie for the disappearance of Jake. Adding fuel to the fire of suspicion, Dave is seen riding Jake's prized bike in town with a new custom paint job and posting pictures of it online.
When family members act so casually about Jake's disappearance, it raises red flags among Jake's friends.
Her early reasoning for where he had gone, we were like, it just doesn't sound right in any way, shape, or form, and we knew something was really wrong, and that likely they had more information than they were speaking on. You know, I think it was kind of patently ridiculous, the things that she said about his training and like the excuses that she made for why he had left town. I mean, they just didn't make any sense to us. I think it was emblematic that she did not understand the relationships that he had at the gym and like what was actually going on up there at all.
Deborah watches her daughter lose control of the situation again. Taking matters into her own hands, she entices Jeremy back into the house to discuss the unfortunate circumstance. Deborah takes care of Jeremy as if he were one of her own. Unaware of how dangerous Deborah is, he allows himself to be hosted.
Deborah, in a joking manner, says it's probably animal remains from Jake's illegal game hunting of a mountain lion or a bear. She then convinces Jeremy and Dave to go back to work and do what they were doing.
Deborah knows more than Dave and Stephanie regarding the remains, but it is a bit hazy about why Jeremy returns to work after their discovery and why no one notifies the authorities. It's pretty evident that Deborah runs the show on the ranch, which could be why Stephanie and Dave don't seem that concerned about the remains. They just take her explanation for it, no questions asked.
Is it out of fear of what Deborah will do that prevents Stephanie, Dave, and Jeremy to ask further questions or alert the authorities?
In a house full of greed, the last thing anyone does is take accountability. Stephanie and Dave bicker about who is at fault for allowing this to happen. If Jeremy leaves the ranch and tells the police what he found, it will mean trouble for the entire family.
As Jeremy and Dave discover these remains in the horse corral, it creates many variables as to what happened.
I can't imagine what they could have been thinking when they uncover the remains at the ranch. Whether any one of them believes Deborah's story or not, they all continue to work on the ranch. Jeremy not only finishes his work in the horse corral, he comes back for more, and no one tells anyone about the incident.
People tend to do rash things when they're scared or they're desperate. There's the fight or flight syndrome, which means you either flee or you stay and fight whatever's going on, the demons or whatever the issue is. In this particular case, everybody here has something at risk. There's a risk of inheritance, the loss of the farm, loss of money, and in the case of Jeremy, he's comfortable. He's filling a void with Jake gone. He's got a sense of family and he's working on this farm. So in this case, everybody has a fight or flight syndrome going on in their head, and they're staying and putting up with what happened.
While Jake's friends are pushing for the investigation of his family, online detectives find Stephanie's cell phone activity continues through the night and into the morning of March 16, 2015, the day of Jake's death, including a received text at 3:17 a.m. reading, "It's time to play," which Stephanie deletes 6 minutes later.
Investigators received multiple tips from the townspeople about the family's activities. They were seen burning Jake's mattress, falsifying titles with his name on them, and selling off his belongings.
These actions by the family, along with Stephanie's online activity, finally spark a full investigation, 2 years after Jake's disappearance.
I think when we're talking about a person being reported missing to authorities, such as the police, we have to take into account that adults can go where they want to go or do what they want to do, and there's no requirement for them to check in necessarily. We often hear of cliches from various places where they say, oh, you have to wait 24 hours or 48 hours before we'll open a missing persons report. And while that may have been the case, back in the day, currently common practice is we would ask as investigators, why do you believe this person is missing? What are the patterns in their life that have been displayed, and what is going on now that would make you think that something is wrong? And if we believe that what you're telling us as investigators has some credibility, I would take into account whether that person is in any danger, what the risks might be. We would look at all of those factors and determine whether or not we have to start looking for them at this immediate point in time.
Police begin to question the family about Jake's disappearance more intently, comparing their answers to their initial statements. As investigators review the family's answers, they find inconsistencies in their stories.
Judicial authorizations, such as search warrants, are difficult by nature to obtain because a person's property is considered private, and police can't just walk onto a property and search it. So police would have to justify to a court, to a judge, why they have grounds to search that property. Without proper grounds to search, a judge isn't going to authorize them to go and do that. Mere suspicion is not enough for a judge to authorize the search of a private property.
Investigators compile as much information as they can on Jake's disappearance, with the information provided by Jake's friends and statements from the townspeople about the strange activity happening on the farm. Investigators obtain a warrant to search the 7-Eleven ranch.
You need the initial authorization from a judge to go and search the property, and once that is granted, then the property is essentially locked down by the police. So they can cordon it off and ensure that nobody can come or go from that property without their authorization. Typically, it depends on what they indicate they're searching for. For example, if I say I'm looking for a bulldozer, I can't go and dig a hole behind the porch and say I'm looking for a bulldozer there. That doesn't qualify. If I have grounds to say that I'm looking for something quite small and it could be hidden anywhere on this property, then anything I come across that may cause me to suspect what I'm looking for is there, I can search for. So if I need to dig a hole at that point, I can dig a hole. It all depends on how that search warrant is worded.
On July 17th, 2017, investigators arrive at the 7-Eleven ranch with a search warrant and begin searching the ranch for any clues that could lead to figuring out Jake Millison's whereabouts.
A search on a very large piece of property would require a coordinated effort by multiple units of a police agency. They would obviously have to sit down and discuss amongst themselves what it is they're looking for and why they suspect it to be on this property. They would then probably organize a ground search to look for some sort of indication that perhaps the ground has been disturbed, any sort of anomaly in the area. Once they've completed that, they would then make a determination whether they need to search further, maybe digging a hole, maybe taking down a building, looking under a concrete slab. Any number of things could come up. There's no way to know until you actually start searching.
With the search of the ranch fully underway, the family is questioned inside. All three are adamant that Jake has not been on the ranch since he left 2 years ago. Authorities bring in cadaver dogs to hopefully sniff out any remains that may be buried on the ranch.
A cadaver dog is used in that moment to look for or detect the odor of a decaying person. It does have a very specific odor, so that's what they would do in that moment.
With the search dogs brought in, investigators eventually come across remains wrapped up and buried near the horse corral.
Once investigators find what they believe is what they're looking for, they would concentrate a lot of their effort on, first of all, recovering the remains and then determining a cause of death if they're able to. Obviously, the forensics unit would be there in full force to document everything that's at the scene, photograph it, look for trace evidence in and around where the body is located. They would make every effort to identify the body and, as I said, to determine a cause of death.
The remains found by investigators are recovered and brought in for autopsy. The autopsy confirms that the remains are that of Jake Millison. Deborah, Stephanie, and Dave are all brought in for questioning. Quartz Creek, Pitkin, Colorado, July 17, 2017. Local authorities storm the 7-Eleven ranch for the warranted search for Jake Millison.
It was always clear to Jake's friends in town that he had disappeared. They also knew he was having trouble at the farm because of his demeanor and his stories he was telling his friends. The hardest part of this was them trying to convince the officials, especially law enforcement, that something was wrong and they should conduct an investigation. However, all this meant is that without a body, there's very little the authorities can do. They have to wait 2 years before they have enough to get a search warrant to search the family farm.
Only a couple of months before the warranted search, Jeremy, Jake's replacement, stumbles upon the remains in the horse corral.
When police find remains on the 7-Eleven ranch during their warranted search, Deborah, Stephanie, and Dave are brought in for further questioning.
In most cases, in law enforcement, there's an obvious trend. When someone's telling the truth, it's consistent. They tell the truth Monday, they tell the truth Friday. What happens is when people tell a lie or a mistruth is they trip up. They'll change the story, they'll put in different details. And it's what you wait for in a case like this, for the story to change. If someone is truthful, the story is consistent right from the beginning to the end. It's when they're lying or covering things up that trouble starts for suspects.
With the financial pressures of a failing ranch and the constant suspicion over Jake's disappearance, all the family members must have been trying to find some way to escape, or at least to purge themselves of any guilt.
As investigators question the family members, Deborah surprises them with a full confession. She murdered Jake. Deborah confesses that on the night she shot her son, she acted alone. Rolling her son off the mattress, wrapping his body in a plastic sheet, using tow straps to maneuver his body out of the lodge and onto an ATV, driving it to the horse corral, and burying his body in a pile of manure. At this time, phone mobile activity assures that Stephanie and Dave are not on the ranch. Dave and Stephanie are brought in separately for questioning, yet their answers are self-serving and contradictory. When the two perpetrators are informed of their mother's full confession, they are shocked. Dave's shock and naivete may be an act to separate his involvement with Jake's murder from the family's. To him, this could be a grand opportunity to rid himself of any suspicion. With Deborah's full confession, it is clear that Jake's death was done with malice. But it doesn't answer who was involved. Up to now, there's no substantial evidence tying Dave and Stephanie to Jake's death.
It would make more sense that Dave or Stephanie killed Jake out of a sense of greed or financial gain.
After officials discover Jake on the ranch, forensic pathologists investigate his remains. The bullet responsible for Jake's death came from a Ladysmith Smith & Wesson .357, a caliber that matches Deborah's gun. At what point can we believe Deborah and the rest of the family? Is it true Deborah did it alone?
It's very unlikely that Deborah was doing this alone. In fact, it's physically impossible.
Obviously, Jake's friends weren't convinced by her stories, but maybe Stephanie and Dave were. They don't seem to know the location of Jake's body, and maybe for good reason.
The two men work in tandem, while the smell gets worse from unearthing more of Jake's remains. Even with facial coverings, they must take breaks from the labor and the smell. It's Stephanie that admits to authorities, a few weeks after her arrest, that she had ordered Dave to move the remains after he and Jeremy accidentally uncovered it.
Dave uses a backhoe to dig a hole in the corral and put Jake's remains and cover it with dirt. After that, the family continued to reference this bear that was buried in the corral, obviously for Jeremy's benefit. The way the family reacted in front of Jeremy when Jake's remains were discovered tells you a lot about the mental condition of these people. Dave, his aloof demeanor, tendency to violence. You've got Stephanie, the spoiled brat, who won't do anything without insulting her mother. And you've got Deborah, the controlling matriarch, who's masterminded this whole thing and controlled the family.
Upon further questioning, Stephanie confesses to finding remains months prior. When the police question Jeremy about this, he admits finding the remains and says the family joked about him not being able to leave the ranch. During Jeremy's testimony, he said that he came back one day to the horse corral and the remains were gone.
Is the story of Jeremy and Dave finding the remains enough to bring Jake's family to jail for his death and disappearance?
In 2019, the verdicts for Deborah, Stephanie, and Dave are in. Their years of covering up and lying about Jake's disappearance are finally at an end.
Stephanie's confession of Dave and Jeremy finding Jake's remains leads the authorities to believe that obviously everybody in this family is involved and somehow in the cover-up and murder of Jake.
In 2019, Stephanie Jackson is charged with accessory to first-degree murder of her brother, Jake Millison, and for tampering with a dead body. She pleads guilty to tampering with a dead body, and in November of 2019, receives the maximum sentence of 24 years in prison. Her husband, Dave Jackson, is also charged with accessory to first-degree murder of Jake Millison and tampering with a dead body. Dave pleads guilty to tampering with a dead body and receives 10 years in prison. Deborah Rudebar receives the longest sentence after being charged with multiple crimes: second-degree murder, tampering with a dead body, and concealing death. On May 13th of 2019, Deborah pleads guilty to second-degree murder and is given a 40-year sentence.
It must have been a grueling 2 years for Jake's friends, seeing his family get away with murder and waiting for authorities to take them seriously enough to finally search the ranch. Jake's friends knew who was responsible all along. For 2 years, they pushed as much as they could to bring the killers of Jake to justice. Even before she gave her confession, they knew it wasn't just Deborah who was responsible. They knew Stephanie and Dave had to have something to do with it too. On November 7th, 2019, the same month that Stephanie is given a 24-year sentence, her mother Deborah dies in prison of breast cancer.
Just my opinion, I don't think the official story is probably fully what really happened, and probably we'll never know what actually happened and what the real motivations were, but I'm glad to see that there was some justice for Jake, because there was a point where maybe there wasn't going to be any. So
Jake clearly had a lot of respect, not from his mother, brother, or sister, but from the community at large. This is truly where a person fits into a community when you've been exorcised from your family and murdered. It shows that there is hope for everyone.